Hi guys, Purple Ella here, and today I'm going to tell you all about how I was diagnosed with autism. So, around a year and a half ago, my eldest son was diagnosed with autism. He was 8 at the time, and after he was diagnosed, I went away and I did so much research. I read books, I read websites, I went on courses. I wanted to know everything that I could about autism so that I could help my son in the best way that I possibly could. Then one day, I'd taken my son out and we were headed to a local area to have a lunch in a cafe. So in my mind, I'd decided where we were going to park, and I get very stressed about parking. So I'd planned out the parking ahead of time and decided exactly where I was going to park. So I drove to the parking space, and when I got there, I realised that that entire area had been turned into residence parking only. So I drove around. I was quite stressed by this because if I wasn't going to park there, I couldn't really imagine what I was going to do next. So I drove around this whole area looking for somewhere to park, and literally the entire area had been converted to residence parking only. And I became really anxious. So I pulled over the car and I became really anxious, and I just couldn't think about what I would do next. We were hungry, it was lunchtime, I was supposed to be parking in this parking space, I was supposed to be going to this cafe. I couldn't do those things, so I panicked and I had what I now recognise as a meltdown, which means I was crying, I was shaking, I was really upset and out of control. And as I had this meltdown, I looked in the back of my car at my son, and I felt obviously horrendously guilty for having a meltdown in front of him. But also, I looked at him, and in that moment, I kind of considered the possibility that perhaps I was autistic, and perhaps that's why I was struggling so much with life, because I really was struggling with life and have done all my life. So we went home and I spoke to my husband about the possibility that I might have autism, and he didn't think I was entirely crazy, which was a surprise. And I spoke to some friends, some good friends who'd known me for a really long time, about whether they thought that I was crazy or whether they thought that I might be onto something. And some of them weren't entirely sure, and they didn't really recognise me as someone who they fit into the sort of stereotype of someone with autism. And some of them said that they actually had considered that possibility before, and that was really surprising. So what I did next was I wrote down a list of all of the problems that I have had from childhood to now that have made my day-to-day life difficult. And I took that list to my GP surgery and I read the list to my GP, and my GP, luckily for me, I was really lucky, referred me to the local adult autism team here in Bristol. So I had to wait quite a while to initially hear back from them, and when I initially heard back from them, they sent me a letter that said that I would be on a waiting list and that they would send me an appointment at some point. Now, obviously, being autistic, being on a waiting list and getting an appointment at some point wasn't really going to work for me. In fact, it would have meant basically that every day for potentially a year or however long I was on this waiting list, I would have been very anxious until the post arrived, and then really stressed after the post arrived that there was no appointment. So I rang them up and I explained the situation, and I was really, really lucky. And I said, I don't really mind if the appointment is a year in the future. I just want it to be scheduled so I know when it's going to happen. So they had a doctor in mind that they knew would do this for me, and they made me an appointment, I think it was about 4 months from that point, when I could see this particular doctor. So great, I had my appointment, and then they sent me a whole bunch of forms, one lot of forms which I was to fill in, and another lot of forms which my husband filled in about the issues that I'd had and specific stuff relating to autism. So we filled those out and waited for the appointment. My appointment was in June of 2015, and it was a 3-hour appointment with Dr. Peter Carpenter, who I was really pleased and lucky to be able to see, because he basically helped write the NICE guidelines on how to diagnose adults with autism. So he's a total expert, well respected in his field. I felt like I could be really secure in the knowledge that whatever decision he made would be the right decision about whether or not I was autistic. So the appointment was really long and really tiring, and basically he asked me loads of questions about things like, how do I cope with crowds? Who are my friends? How do I cope with my friends? Am I someone who would just sit and watch a sunset, was one of the questions, which no way, because what's the point in that? He asked my husband lots of questions, and I had no idea what the correct answer or the incorrect answer to the questions were. I just answered as honestly as I possibly could. And then he did a section of the ADOS test, that's ADOS, look it up, and it basically involved, he had a storybook that had no words, only pictures, and he came and sat uncomfortably close to me, I must say, because I really don't like people sitting too close, and asked me to make up a story using this book and read it to him. Now I kind of think that I'm pretty creative, so I went for it with this story, and I think I made up a pretty great story. And then after that he got out a bag which had 7 or 8 objects in it. I don't remember exactly what they were. Things like a cotton reel, a toy car, a matchstick, that kind of stuff. And he asked me to pick 3 objects and to make up a story with them. I don't actually remember which objects I picked. It's all a bit of a blur that day, to be honest. But I picked 3 objects and I made up a story with them. And then he said that he needed to go and confer with someone else. So we went to wait in the waiting room, and I was entirely convinced that this meant that I was not autistic, because clearly I had made up an amazing story with both the storybook and the objects being the creative genius that I considered myself to be, and that therefore meant that I was not autistic, because I didn't really fully understand that autism and imagination, the kind of imaginations we're talking about with autism, are kind of different. Anyway, my husband and I, we went back in, and he sat us down and basically told me that he was 100% sure that I am autistic, and that he was going to be diagnosing me with autism that day. So I did actually ask him about the story and why me acing the story did not negate me having autism, and he said that I had read a brilliant story, but I had not interacted with him at all in any way, and had basically just been doing what he had told me to do without the telling him a story part. And that when I had chosen my objects and made up my story with them, I had kept them as exactly the objects that I had chosen, and I had not changed them in any way. And to be honest, it hadn't even occurred to me that they could be anything other than the objects that had been in that bag. So I left with a diagnosis of autism after this very draining 3-hour appointment. And to be honest, I sort of initially had thought that I would come away and be like, yeah, I know what's happening with me, I'm autistic, it's fine, I can come up with strategies, I can move forward. And what I didn't expect was this massive grief that I experienced for around 5 or 6 months after the diagnosis, of kind of coming to terms with what that meant for me, the fact that it was kind of a lifelong situation, the fact that kind of a grief for my life without knowing about autism, kind of a grief for having had such a long time of struggle without knowing why, kind of a grief for having been misdiagnosed with depression or bipolar or whatever the mental health team stuck on me each time I went to see them, kind of a grief for what I could have achieved with my life had I have known that I was autistic and had I have had the right support. So I went through that, and then I started working, and I read books, and I started working on what I could do to change my situation, what I could do to make my day-to-day life easier to cope with, what I could do to basically move forward with the new knowledge that I had as a stronger and happier person. So we're a year on from diagnosis, exactly last week, 1 year on. And has life changed? I mean, life has changed inside of me massively. I feel like I understand who I am. I feel like I understand why I've struggled, why other people have struggled to understand me. I feel like I've taken a very small step on the journey towards accepting this diagnosis and understanding what I need to be happier. But in the years since the diagnosis, I've found a few potential career paths, having been unemployed for quite a long time. And I've met some new people who understand autism and seem to understand me. The people around me have tried really hard to be accommodating on the whole and understanding of my autism and how that affects me and how they can help. So on the whole, I would say being diagnosed with autism has been a really positive experience for me and has left me a stronger and happier person than prior to the diagnosis. It's still very early days, considering 36 years no diagnosis, 1 year with a diagnosis. So I'd like to think that it's still very early days and there's still going to be a lot of great progress for me, and I'm going to be even happier and even stronger in the years to come. So that's my diagnosis story. I hope it's been helpful. Feel free to leave a comment in the comment section if you want to ask me any questions or tell me about your experience. Also, I'm planning on uploading more regular videos about autism, so if you'd like to watch more videos about autism, then subscribe.